The heavy oak door blew open with a violent splintering crack, and a massive body crashed onto the floorboards, bringing the deadly whiteout directly into the cabin. Garrison dropped his iron poker. His instincts, sharpened by decades as a Texas Ranger, surged back to life. He reached for the Winchester rifle resting against the stone hearth, his bad leg protesting the sudden movement. The wind howled a demonic shriek through the doorway, violently extinguishing the glass oil lamps and leaving only the blood-orange glow of the fireplace to illuminate the intruder. He stepped forward, the rifle leveled against his broad shoulder, fully ready for the violence that always seemed to follow him. But the figure groaning on the frozen floorboards did not reach for a weapon. The figure did not rise. It was a woman. But the truth of how this towering, broken soul came to bleed on the floorboards of a retired lawman was far more complicated than anyone could have imagined. Stay with me until the end of this memory, and leave a comment telling me where you are listening from to see just how far a story of survival and second chances can travel. Garrison lowered his rifle. The winter storm roared through the open doorway, biting fiercely into his sun-bronzed, weathered face. He rushed forward, fighting against the invisible wall of the gale, and slammed the heavy oak door shut, throwing the thick iron bolt into place with a definitive metallic thud. The sudden silence inside the cabin was heavy and immediate, broken only by the crackle of the burning pine and the ragged, shallow breathing of the stranger. He knelt beside her. She lay face down, an absolute giant of a woman. In the dim light, Garrison saw she possessed a towering frame that rivaled the largest frontier men he had ever known. Broad shoulders tapered into a powerful back, covered by a simple, torn light blue dress that offered zero protection against the frozen wilderness. Her heavy leather boots were worn down to the soles, carrying the brutal scars of 1,000 miles of hardship. Ice clung desperately to her long, messy blonde hair, locking the thick strands together like frozen ropes. Garrison hooked his rough hands under her arms to pull her toward the roaring fire. He grunted, his breath catching in his chest. She was incredibly heavy. Dense, raw muscle filled out her towering frame, forcing Garrison to plant his boots wide and strain his own broad shoulders just to drag her across the floorboards. His old knee injury flared with an agonizing burn, but he ignored the pain, his singular focus narrowing down to the fragile flicker of life remaining within her. He arranged her gently on the woven rug near the hearth. The intense heat from the fire began to melt the snow clinging to her clothes, forming dark, spreading puddles on the wooden floor. Garrison grabbed a heavy woolen blanket from his armchair and draped it over her massive, trembling shoulders. This was supposed to be his first Christmas completely alone. After a lifetime of delivering harsh frontier justice, he had retreated to this remote mountain cabin to finally find peace. Instead, he had found a deafening, suffocating silence. He had spent the last 3 days staring at the snowdrifts, wondering if a man like him even deserved to celebrate a season of hope. And now, the unforgiving mountain had delivered this mysterious, half-frozen giantess directly to his doorstep. Her pale lips trembled. A violent shiver racked her powerful body. She was dying of the cold. Garrison knew the cruel arithmetic of mountain blizzards. The human body could only endure so much before the spirit surrendered. If he did not warm her blood quickly, her heart would simply stop beating. He moved with practiced efficiency. He filled a cast iron kettle with water and set it over the flames, then gathered clean linen rags from his wooden supply chest. He knelt back down beside her, his weathered face tight with a profound concern he had not felt in years. Her breathing remained frighteningly shallow. The fabric of her light blue dress was frozen stiff, clinging to her remarkably muscular arms like an icy shell. She needed to be warm, and she needed to be treated with absolute dignity. Garrison reached out, his heavily calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he grasped the torn edge of her sleeve to inspect the damage to her flesh. The skin was ice-cold to the touch. He fully expected to find deep blackened frostbite or perhaps the violent bruising of a terrible fall down the treacherous mountain ridges. He pulled the frozen fabric back, exposing her massive, perfectly sculpted bicep and the thick, powerful curve of her shoulder. The breath completely left his lungs. There, burned deeply into the pale skin of her powerful shoulder, was a harsh, black, and jagged scar. It was not an injury from the storm. It was a brand. The brutal, unmistakable iron stamp of an industrial lumber company burned directly into human flesh. Someone out there did not see a woman. They saw a beast of burden. They saw a piece of property. And whoever those cruel men were, Garrison knew with terrifying certainty that they would come looking for what they had lost. Garrison remained frozen, his sharp, observant eyes locked onto the brutal brand marking her flesh. For a man who had spent his entire life studying the dark corners of the human heart, the absolute cruelty burned into the skin of this towering woman sent a righteous, icy fury surging through his veins. He quickly pulled the heavy woolen blanket back over her massive, remarkably muscular shoulder, hiding the horrific scar from the flickering firelight. He did not want her to wake up and feel the shame of that mark under the gaze of a stranger. A sudden, sharp intake breath shattered the heavy silence of the cabin. Rowena jolted awake. Pure, unadulterated terror radiated from her wide, fractured gaze. She scrambled backward, her chunky leather boots scraping frantically against the wooden floorboards until her broad back slammed against the rough stone of the fireplace. Her chest heaved. Her large, capable hands gripped the edges of the woolen blanket like a shield. She looked at the crackling fire, then at the sturdy log walls, and finally at the towering, bearded mountain man kneeling just a few feet away. She did not wait for him to speak. She did not ask where she was. Her mind, deeply conditioned by months of unrelenting brutality in the industrialized lumber camps, screamed a single, terrifying command. She had to work. If she did not prove her physical usefulness, she would be cast back out into the deadly whiteout. A draft animal that cannot pull its own weight is quickly discarded. That was the brutal law of the men who had owned her. That was the only truth she had ever known. Rowena forced her towering, battered frame to stand. Her massive thighs trembled under the immense weight of her own body, and a wave of dizziness threatened to drop her back to the floor. But she refused to fall. She possessed a towering height that easily matched the rugged man before her, and she wielded that sheer size now out of pure desperation. She stumbled toward the corner of the room, where a large pile of unsplit pine logs waited beside a heavy iron-splitting axe. Garrison stood slowly, favoring his bad leg. He extended a weathered, calloused hand, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. Rowena ignored him. She dropped the blanket to the floor. The torn sleeves of her light blue dress exposed the incredibly well-developed muscles of her biceps and shoulders as she bent down to grasp the heavy axe. Her breath came in ragged, desperate gasps. She hauled a thick pine log onto the wooden splitting stump. She raised the heavy iron axe high above her head, her broad back cording with tremendous physical power, preparing to shatter the wood. She wanted to show this silent, intimidating man that she was strong. She needed him to see that she could earn her place beside his fire. Garrison stepped forward. He moved with the quiet, undeniable authority of a man who had commanded dangerous situations for decades. He did not raise his voice. He did not make any sudden, threatening gestures. He simply stepped directly into the downward path of the axe, placing his own towering frame between her and the chopping block. Rowena froze. Her massive arms held the heavy iron blade suspended in the air. Her chest heaved as panic flooded her exhausted features. Her eyes darted wildly, waiting for the blow, waiting for the harsh reprimand, waiting for the violent punishment that always followed a mistake. Garrison reached up slowly. He wrapped his large, sun-bronzed fingers around the rough wooden handle of the axe, resting his hand gently just below hers. He did not pull. He simply held the weight, waiting for her to release it. His sharp, observant eyes locked onto hers, speaking volumes in the quiet space between them. The howling winter storm outside battered the thick log walls, but inside the cabin, the heavy silence felt almost sacred. Garrison looked at the sheer size of her, at the incredible physical dominance she possessed, and he did not see a monster. He did not see a machine built for labor. He saw a deeply wounded, terrified woman fighting a battle entirely within her own mind. Slowly, her tightly clenched fingers began to loosen. Garrison took the heavy axe from her massive hands and set it gently on the floorboards. He reached down, picked up the fallen woolen blanket, and draped it carefully over her powerful, trembling shoulders once again. He gestured toward the oversized rocking chair situated beside the roaring hearth. Rowena swallowed hard, the frantic beating of her heart slowly giving way to a profound, aching confusion. No one had ever stopped her from working. No one had ever looked at her towering, wildly muscular body and offered her rest. She walked slowly toward the fire, sinking into the deep cushions of the chair. The warmth of the flames immediately began to soothe the deep, agonizing ache in her frozen bones. Garrison walked across the room to a small, weathered wooden trunk resting beneath the frosted windowpane. He knelt beside it, the brass hinges groaning softly as he opened the heavy lid. He reached inside, his broad shoulders slouching slightly under an unseen emotional weight. When he turned back around, he carried something small and delicate in his calloused hands. He walked back to the fire and stood beside her. Gently, he reached out and took her massive, scarred right hand. He turned her palm upward and placed a tiny, intricately hand-carved wooden toy horse into the center of her hand. Rowena stared at the beautiful, delicate carving. The wood was polished smooth by years of loving touch. She looked up at the stoic, emotionally restrained mountain man, realizing suddenly that the deafening silence of this cabin was not born of peace. It was born of an unbearable absence. Who did this solitary, dangerous man lose? And why was he spending Christmas completely alone in the shadows of his own grief? The winter storm waged a relentless war against the thick log walls of the cabin, but inside, a fragile, unspoken peace began to settle over the solitary room. Rowena sat motionless in the oversized rocking chair, her massive thumb gently tracing the smooth wooden back of the carved horse. She was acutely aware of her own overwhelming size in the small, quiet space. Her broad shoulders and heavily muscled thighs took up nearly the entire chair. In the brutal confines of the lumber camps, her tremendous physical stature had been nothing but a curse, earning her exhausting workloads and cruel, dehumanizing insults. The foreman looked at her thick biceps and towering frame and saw only a freak of nature, a giant beast meant solely for hauling heavy timber through the mud. But Garrison did not look at her that way. She watched him through the flickering firelight as he moved around the small kitchen area. He walked with a heavy, deliberate limp, yet his powerful frame commanded the space with a quiet, undeniable grace. He was preparing a meal, slicing salted pork and root potatoes with a weathered hunting knife. Not once did he command her to sweep the floorboards. Not once did he demand she fetch water from the frozen pump outside. He treated her with absolute dignity. The savory aroma of roasting meat and rich broth filled the room, replacing the bitter scent of the freezing blizzard. Garrison ladled thick, hot stew into 2 deep tin bowls. He carried them to the sturdy oak table and set them down, then pulled out a heavy chair, gesturing silently for her to join him. Rowena carefully set the wooden toy on the stone mantelpiece, treating the delicate carving as if it were made of spun glass. She stood, her towering height casting a long shadow across the room, and walked slowly to the table. She sat down awkwardly, fully expecting him to dole out a meager, punishing ration, just as the camp bosses always did to remind the workers of their complete dependence. Instead, Garrison pushed the larger bowl toward her. He poured her a steaming cup of dark coffee, his sharp, observant eyes catching the fresh tears welling in her fractured gaze. He understood the profound tragedy of her surprise. A woman of her immense muscular size required substantial sustenance, yet she had clearly been starved of both basic nutrition and human kindness for a very long time. They ate in absolute silence. For the first time in her entire life, the quiet did not feel like a looming threat. In the lumber camps, silence meant the overseer was sneaking up behind you with a heavy leather strap. Here, in the warm glow of the fireplace, The silence felt remarkably safe. It was a shared space, a gentle sanctuary, where two heavily scarred souls could simply exist without needing to justify their right to draw breath. Garrison watched the way she held her tin spoon. Despite her incredibly well-developed muscles and heavy, calloused hands, she moved with a quiet, careful elegance. She possessed a deeply buried femininity, a gentle and profoundly compassionate heart trapped beneath a rugged exterior built purely for survival. The deafening loneliness that had plagued his early retirement suddenly felt incredibly distant. For the first time since he had locked away his silver badge, the cabin felt like a real home. Hours bled slowly into the deep of the night. The violent wind outside began to die down, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating blanket of freshly fallen snow that insulated the cabin from the rest of the world. Rowena rested on the woven rug near the hearth, wrapped tightly in the heavy woolen blanket, while Garrison sat in his armchair, a worn leather journal resting open on his lap. The gentle attachment forming between them was unspoken, yet it hummed with undeniable warmth. Rowena felt a profound sense of safety washing over her battered spirit. She was warm. She was fed. She was finally seen as a human being. Perhaps, she dared to hope, she could simply disappear into these remote mountains, heal her shattered confidence, and finally claim a quiet life of her own. Then, the fragile illusion of safety completely shattered. The heavy, sickening thud of a closed fist struck the heavy oak door. Rowena scrambled backward across the floorboards, pure terror seizing her lungs. She recognized that harsh, demanding rhythm instantly. It was the exact sound the camp overseer made before dragging a worker out into the freezing mud for a brutal beating. The violent strike came again, much louder this time, rattling the thick iron bolt in its metal housing. A deep, vicious barking erupted from the other side of the thick wood, hunting dogs. The desperate, hungry snarls of hounds trained to track human prey across the frozen frontier echoed terribly through the darkness. The men who owned the brand on her shoulder had not let the deadly blizzard deter them. They had come to reclaim their stolen property, and they had brought the fury of hell with them. The heavy pounding shook the log walls again, sending dust raining down from the wooden rafters. Rowena pressed her broad back against the rough stone hearth, her wildly muscular frame trembling like a trapped animal. She curled her thick, powerful arms over her chest, trying desperately to make her massive body disappear. She knew exactly what would happen next. The men outside would flash a handful of bounty money, and this quiet mountain man would hand her over without a second thought. It was the brutal reality of the frontier. Why would a total stranger risk his own life for a branded laborer? Garrison did not look at the heavy oak door. He looked directly at her. The gentle, quiet demeanor he had shown her over their shared meal vanished entirely. His sharp, observant eyes hardened into chips of cold flint. The honorable, stoic protector, buried beneath years of painful retirement, resurrected in a single heartbeat. He reached out and grabbed the Winchester rifle resting against his armchair. He levered around into the chamber with a sharp, metallic clack that cut cleanly through the snarling of the hounds outside. He pointed a weathered finger toward the dark corner behind the heavy oak wardrobe, instructing her silently. Rowena pushed herself up on her thick, heavily muscled thighs, moving swiftly into the deep shadows. Her heart hammered a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. Her vulnerability deepened with every passing second. For the first time in her entire life, she was not fighting her own battle. Someone was standing between her and the whip. Garrison unlocked the heavy iron bolt. He pulled the door open just enough to fill the gap with his broad, powerful frame, keeping the warm light of the hearth from spilling out onto the porch. The vicious winter wind howled immediately, whipping snow around the dark silhouettes of three men on horseback. Two large tracking hounds strained furiously against thick leather leashes, snapping their jaws toward the warmth of the cabin. The leader, a man wrapped in a heavy buffalo coat, leaned forward in his saddle. He held a kerosene lantern that illuminated his cruel, heavily scarred face. "We are tracking stolen property," the man sneered, spitting a stream of dark tobacco into the pristine white snow. a giant runaway draft girl, massive shoulders, built like a draft horse. She wears the iron brand of the Blackwood Lumber Company on her right arm. The hounds tracked her scent right to your steps. Garrison stood perfectly still. He rested the long barrel of the Winchester casually across his forearm, his finger resting just outside the trigger guard. He did not deny her presence. He did not negotiate. "You are trespassing," Garrison rumbled, his voice carrying the low, dangerous weight of an impending avalanche. The tracker scoffed, dropping a hand toward the heavy revolver resting on his hip. "I have a legal bounty for that beast. Step aside, old man, or we will drag her out over your dead body. She belongs to the mill." The violent threat hung heavily in the freezing air. From her place in the shadows, Rowena squeezed her eyes shut. A single tear tracked down her resolute, scarred face. She prepared to surrender. She could not let this honorable, quiet man die for her. She flexed her massive, powerful biceps, ready to step out of the darkness and submit to the iron chains, but Garrison did not step aside. "She is a woman," Garrison stated, his voice laced with absolute chilling authority, "and I am Garrison Vance, former captain of the Texas Rangers. I have killed men for far less than threatening me on my own porch." The leader froze. The name carried a legendary bloody weight across the Western Territories. The tracker looked at the cold, unblinking eyes of the towering mountain man, then down at the rifle held with absolute practiced steadiness. He knew the stories. Garrison Vance did not miss, and he did not show mercy to men who preyed on the weak. Garrison leaned forward slightly, the dim light catching the dangerous, protective fury in his gaze. "That woman is under my protection. She is an honored guest in my home. If any man attempts to cross this threshold tonight, I will leave his body for the mountain wolves." The tension stretched into a terrifying eternity. The tracker weighed his options. The blizzard was worsening. His hounds were freezing. And facing a legendary ranger in a heavily fortified doorway was a fool's errand for just 3 tired men. The leader jerked his reins sharply, pulling his horse away from the porch. "You cannot hide a giant forever, Vance," he barked, his voice filled with absolute malice. "Enjoy your peaceful night. Because tomorrow's Christmas Day. We will be back at sunrise with 10 more armed men, and we will burn this cabin to the ground to get our property." Garrison watched them ride away into the blinding whiteout. He pulled the door shut and threw the heavy iron bolt back into place. The deafening silence returned to the room, but the fragile peace was completely shattered. Garrison leaned against the thick wood, his broad shoulders sagging slightly as the adrenaline faded, leaving the deep ache of his old injury in its wake. Rowena stepped out of the shadows, her fractured gaze locked onto the stoic protector who had just signed his own death warrant to keep her safe. Tomorrow was Christmas Day, and a private army was coming to destroy the only sanctuary she had ever known. Rowena stared at the broad, powerful back of the retired ranger. The terrifying reality of the morning weighed heavily upon her chest. She stepped forward, her massive hands trembling slightly as she reached out to touch the heavy leather of his ranch jacket. "You must let me go," she whispered, her voice cracking under the immense weight of her own guilt. "They will kill you. I am not worth the blood of a good man." Garrison turned slowly. He looked up at her towering frame, his weathered face entirely devoid of fear. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice to demand obedience. Instead, he walked past her, his heavy boots sounding a steady rhythm against the floorboards, and moved toward the stone hearth. He reached into a woven basket sitting near the stacked firewood. He pulled out a handful of fragrant green pine boughs and a long string of dried cranberries. The stark contrast between the impending violence of the dawn and his quiet domestic actions left Rowena entirely bewildered. "Help me hang these," Garrison murmured, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "It is Christmas Eve. No home should be completely barren on a night like this." Rowena hesitated, her heavily muscled arms hanging loosely at her sides. She fully expected him to barricade the frosted windows, to clean his heavy weapons, to prepare for a brutal siege against the men who wanted to chain her. Instead, He handed her a length of woven twine and pointed toward the heavy wooden mantel. She possessed an exceptional height, allowing her to easily reach the high wooden beams of the cabin without standing on a stool. She took the green pine boughs, her thick, powerful fingers handling the delicate needles with surprising tenderness. As they worked together in the warm, flickering firelight, the heavy, suffocating tension between them began to shift. The pure terror of the coming dawn slowly gave way to a profound, unspoken longing. Rowena watched the stoic mountain man arrange the small wooden toys along the stone ledge. The fire cast long, dancing shadows across his sun-bronzed skin, highlighting the deep, weary lines around his sharp, observant eyes. She felt a desperate, agonizing pull in her chest. For the first time in her brutal, exhausted existence, she wanted to stay. She wanted to belong to this quiet, safe place. She longed to stand beside this honorable protector, not as a burden, but as an equal partner in a peaceful life. "I made those wooden toys a lifetime ago," Garrison breathed softly, his gaze staring deeply into the dancing flames. "For a little boy who never received the chance to grow up." Rowena stopped tying the woven twine. She looked down at the delicate carved horse resting near the warmth of the crackling fire. "I wore a silver badge for 30 years, Garrison continued, his voice heavy with the crushing grief of 100 silent failures. "I protected judges, bankers, and wealthy ranchers across the Western Territories. But when the winter fever swept through our homestead, all the authority in the world could not save my own son. I could not protect the only precious soul that truly mattered." He turned his head slowly, looking deeply into her fractured, luminous gaze. The absolute vulnerability in his weathered expression shattered the final defensive walls guarding the fiercely compassionate heart of Rowena. "I retired because the silver badge felt like a terrible lie," Garrison whispered, a raw, undeniable ache bleeding through his stoic composure. "I swore I would never fight another violent battle. I locked myself in these remote mountains to simply disappear. But watching you stand on that porch tonight, seeing the sheer courage of a woman refusing to let a cruel world break her spirit, it reminded me of the honorable man I used to be. It reminded me that some things are still worth defending." Rowena felt a hot tear escape her eye, tracking a slow, salty path down her scarred cheek. The emotional redemption in his quiet words washed over her battered soul like a healing spring rain. He was not protecting her out of pity. He was protecting her because she gave his broken, grieving spirit a real reason to fight again. The unspoken longing between them swelled immensely, filling the small cabin with a radiant warmth that completely defied the freezing blizzard outside. They stood close, the towering, wildly muscular giantess and the heavily scarred protector, bound together by a shared understanding of deep, isolating pain. But as the dark hours crept slowly past midnight, the horrific reality of the coming dawn returned to haunt the mind of the runaway woman. Garrison finally sat down in his heavy leather armchair. The relentless adrenaline of the confrontation and the agonizing burn in his old knee injury finally overcame his iron will. His eyes fluttered closed, and his deep, even breathing signaled a heavy, exhausted sleep. Rowena stood silently by the dying fire, her massive silhouette perfectly still. She looked at the peaceful, honorable face of the man who had just given her back her dignity. She could not let him die for her. She could not allow the immense cruelty of her past to destroy the only beautiful sanctuary she had ever known. If the armed trackers arrived at sunrise and found the cabin entirely empty, they would move on. Garrison would remain safe. She reached down, her thick, powerful fingers gently tracing the soft edge of the woolen blanket. She draped it carefully over his broad, sleeping shoulders, holding back a quiet, broken sob. Without making a single sound, the towering giantess unbolted the heavy oak door and stepped back out into the deadly, freezing whiteout, leaving the absolute warmth of the fire completely behind. The sharp, biting draft of the winter wind brushed against the weathered face of the sleeping mountain man. Garrison jolted awake, his sharp, observant eyes immediately scanning the dim light of the cabin. The heavy woolen blanket slipped from his broad shoulders, pooling softly around his boots. The heavy oak door stood unbolted, rattling slightly against the iron frame as the blizzard relentlessly battered the exterior. The oversized rocking chair was entirely empty. A profound, absolute fear of loss seized his chest, far colder and far more brutal than the raging blizzard outside. He understood instantly what she had done. The towering, wildly muscular woman had chosen to walk into a frozen grave rather than let violence touch the man who had shown her kindness. She was offering a sacred sacrifice, trading her own battered life to ensure he saw another Christmas in peace. Garrison did not hesitate. He did not bother layering his heavy ranch jacket over his worn work shirt. He simply grabbed his Winchester rifle and pushed his powerful frame through the doorway, plunging directly into the violent whiteout. The storm was completely unforgiving. The deep snowdrifts immediately swallowed his heavy leather boots. The howling gale whipped across his sun-bronzed skin, stealing the breath directly from his lungs. He forced his way through the freezing darkness, tracking the deep, heavy impressions left by her chunky leather boots. His old knee injury screamed in agonizing protest with every step, the damaged joint stiffening rapidly in the bitter cold. He pushed harder, driven by a desperate, roaring need to protect her. He had already lost his young son to the cruel indifference of the frontier. He absolutely refused to lose this deeply compassionate, fiercely brave woman to the very same darkness. A sudden, violent crack echoed through the howling wind. High above him on the steep incline, the massive, rotting trunk of a dead pine tree finally surrendered to the immense weight of the ice. Garrison looked up, but the blinding snow obscured the danger until it was entirely too late. The heavy timber crashed downward, striking his broad shoulder and slamming him violently into the deep snow. The tremendous weight of the frozen wood pinned his bad leg and trapped his powerful chest against the frozen earth. He grunted, a sharp gasp of pain escaping his lips as the heavy bark crushed against his ribs. He pushed his heavily calloused hands against the thick trunk, but his leverage was entirely gone. He was trapped in the deadly cold, and the freezing numbness immediately began to seep into his blood. Further down the mountain ridge, Rowena marched through the blinding snow, her teeth chattering violently. She welcomed the freezing pain. If she walked far enough, the bounty trackers would find her frozen body miles away from the quiet sanctuary of the cabin. But then, the sharp crack of the falling timber echoed across the ridge, cutting through the roaring gale. She stopped. A terrible, agonizing panic gripped her gentle heart. She knew that horrific sound of breaking wood. Rowena turned her towering frame around and plunged back through the deep snowdrifts, completely ignoring the brutal, biting wind tearing at her torn, light blue dress. She found him buried beneath the massive pine, his weathered face dangerously pale and his breathing frighteningly shallow. Garrison looked up at her, his sharp, observant eyes begging her to run, commanding her silently to leave him and save herself. She absolutely refused. Rowena dropped to her knees in the freezing snow. She looked at the incredibly massive, heavily muscled arms that she had always despised. Her entire life, her towering height and deeply developed muscles, had brought her nothing but cruel labor and brutal mockery. She had hated her own physical power. But in this desperate, frozen moment, she finally understood a profound truth. Her immense physical strength was not a curse. It was the exact gift required to save the life of the only man who had ever treated her with dignity. She slid her thick, powerful hands underneath the rough bark of the frozen timber. She planted her chunky leather boots deep into the snow, widening her stance to engage her massive thighs. She closed her eyes, letting out a raw, desperate cry that challenged the howling blizzard. Her incredibly well-developed biceps swelled against the torn sleeves of her dress. Her broad back corded with tremendous, awe-inspiring physical power as she drove upward. The massive tree trunk groaned, the freezing wood protesting violently against her unyielding strength. She pushed harder, ignoring the agonizing burn in her heavy muscles, lifting the crushing weight just high enough for Garrison to drag his battered body out from underneath. The heavy timber crashed back down into the snow, the violent impact shaking the ground. Rowena stumbled backward. The immense physical exertion combined with the brutal, freezing cold entirely drained the last remaining reserves of her energy. Her vision blurred into absolute darkness. Her towering, wildly muscular body collapsed backward into the deep snow, completely unresponsive. Garrison scrambled toward her, dragging his crushed leg through the freezing drifts. He pulled her heavy, unconscious frame against his powerful chest, but her skin was terrifyingly cold. The storm raged violently around them, burying them both in the unrelenting whiteout. They had sacrificed everything for each other, but out here in the frozen dark, a terrifying question remained. Would the morning sun rise on a second chance at life, or would the unforgiving mountain claim them both before Christmas morning could finally dawn? Garrison refused to surrender to the freezing darkness. He gripped the thick fabric of her light blue dress, his heavy, calloused hands burning with the brutal chill of the blizzard. He wrapped his powerful, uninjured arm around her broad, muscular waist and pulled. The agony in his crushed knee radiated through his heavy frame, threatening to drag him down into unconsciousness. But the desperate, roaring need to save this fiercely compassionate woman fueled his battered body. Step by agonizing step, the stoic mountain man hauled the towering giantess through the blinding whiteout. The warm glow of the unbolted cabin doorway served as their only beacon in the frozen wilderness. When they finally crossed the wooden threshold, Garrison collapsed, kicking the heavy oak door shut behind them and throwing the iron bolt securely into place. They had survived the deadly mountain. He dragged her massive, unmoving form directly onto the woven rug beside the stone hearth. His heavily calloused hands moved frantically, throwing dry pine logs onto the dying embers until a roaring fire pushed the brutal cold away. He wrapped the heavy woolen blanket around her broad shoulders, rubbing her incredibly well-developed arms to force the warm blood back into her frozen veins. Slowly, the pale color returned to her resolute, scarred face. Rowena drew a deep, ragged breath, her luminous gaze fluttering open. She looked up at the weathered, sun-bronzed face of her protector, and then her eyes fell upon his mangled leg. The heavy denim of his frontier trousers was torn, and his heavy frame trembled from the crushing impact of the fallen timber. She did not ask for permission. She pushed her towering, wildly muscular body upward, ignoring her own profound exhaustion. Her thick, capable fingers gently took hold of his heavy leather boot, carefully removing it to inspect the damage to his knee. Her touch, despite the immense physical power hidden within her massive hands, was profoundly tender. They sat together on the floorboards as the dark hours of Christmas Eve ticked softly away, tending to each other in the absolute safety of the firelight. The suffocating silence of the lonely cabin was entirely gone, replaced by a sacred, undeniable intimacy. The final defensive walls guarding their deeply wounded hearts began to crumble completely into the ash. "My entire life, they told me I was a monster," Rowena whispered, her voice trembling with the heavy weight of 1,000 cruel insults. She looked down at her thick, heavy thighs and the raw, immense muscles of her biceps. "They said a body built like mine was meant only for hauling timber and pulling heavy wagons. They told me I was too massive, too ugly, and too wild to ever be loved as a woman. I believed them. I believed I was nothing but a broken draft animal." Garrison reached out, his sharp, observant eyes softening with absolute, unwavering devotion. His calloused fingers gently brushed a messy strand of blonde hair away from her damp cheek. "You are the most beautiful, courageous woman I have ever known," Garrison breathed slowly, his tone vibrating with a profound, healing truth. "Your strength is a magnificent gift. You used these powerful hands to lift a mountain off my chest tonight. You saved my life. There is no monster in this room, Rowena. There's only a fierce, gentle heart that deserves to be cherished." A quiet, broken sob escaped her lips. The crushing burden of her shame shattered entirely under the weight of his absolute acceptance. She leaned her resolute face into his warm palm, finally finding the profound belonging she had sought her entire life. "I believed I was completely empty," Garrison murmured, his broad shoulders dropping as he confessed his own deepest fear. When I could not save my boy, I buried my own soul in the freezing dirt right beside him. I came to this remote mountain to die a slow, silent death. I believed I was totally unworthy of forgiveness, unworthy of building a new family. But when I look at you, I do not see the end of my life. I see a beautiful, radiant beginning. Rowena shifted her massive frame closer, wrapping her incredibly powerful arms gently around his broad back. She held the stoic, heavily scarred protector against her chest, offering him the absolute emotional safety he had denied himself for years. They held each other as the long, dark night finally surrendered to the dawn. The deep wounds of their pasts were thoroughly washed away by the quiet, undeniable miracle of forgiveness. The violent blizzard outside finally ceased, leaving behind a perfectly still, breathtaking Christmas morning. The golden sunlight pierced through the frosted window panes, casting a warm, hopeful glow across the wooden floorboards. Then the peaceful silence completely shattered. The heavy rhythmic crunch of hooves tearing through the deep snow echoed outside the cabin. The vicious snorting of horses and the metallic clinking of heavy iron chains announced the terrifying reality. The bounty trackers had returned with a full posse of armed men, forcing a final deadly confrontation on the holiest morning of the year. The heavy, rhythmic crunch of hooves tearing through the deep snow echoed outside the cabin. The vicious snorting of horses and the metallic clinking of heavy iron chains announced the terrifying reality. The bounty trackers had returned with a full posse, forcing a final confrontation on the holiest morning of the year. Rowena stood up from the woven rug, her massive, muscular frame bracing for the violence she believed was entirely inevitable. She looked at the heavy Winchester rifle resting near the hearth, fully prepared to take up arms to defend the man she loved. Garrison reached out, his calloused hand gently wrapping around her thick, powerful wrist. He did not reach for his weapon. He did not prepare for a bloody shootout. Instead, he walked toward the heavy oak wardrobe, favoring his damaged knee, and pulled out a small, heavy iron lockbox. He unlocked the heavy wooden door and stepped out onto the snowy porch. The blinding whiteout had passed, leaving behind a brilliant, sunlit winter morning. 10 men sat on horseback in the pristine snow, their heavy winter coats dusted with white frost. The cruel tracker from the previous night sat at the front, flanked by a man wearing the heavy wool suit of a lumber company overseer. "We brought the law, Vance," the tracker barked, a sneer twisting his scarred face. "Hand over the runaway giant, or we will take her by force." Garrison stood tall, his broad shoulders projecting an absolute unyielding authority. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten them with the legendary violence of his past. "There will be no force upon this mountain," Garrison rumbled, his deep voice carrying clearly across the crisp morning air. He looked directly at the company overseer. "You hold a bounty for a laborer. You claim she owes a debt of service to the Blackwood Lumber Company." The overseer nodded slowly, intimidated by the sheer commanding presence of the retired lawman. "She is property, and she owes us $500 in unfinished labor." Garrison opened the heavy iron lockbox. He pulled out a thick stack of federal banknotes, the entirety of his life savings from 30 years of dangerous frontier service. He walked slowly down the wooden steps, ignoring the agonizing pain in his knee, and tossed the heavy stack of money directly into the snow at the feet of the overseer's horse. "Count it," Garrison commanded, his sharp, observant eyes locking onto the greedy face of the businessman. "That is $1,000, double her supposed debt. You will sign over her contract immediately, and you will never speak her name again." The men on horseback stared in absolute shock. The cruel tracker looked at the massive pile of wealth, his threats completely dissolving into the cold air. The overseer scrambled down from his saddle, gathering the banknotes with trembling hands. He quickly pulled a folded legal document from his breast pocket and handed it over. Garrison took the heavy parchment. He did not look at the men as they turned their horses around and rode silently away, taking the cruelty of the past with them forever. He walked back up the wooden steps and stepped inside the cabin, shutting the heavy oak door. Rowena stood near the roaring fire, her luminous gaze wide with absolute disbelief. She possessed a towering height, a wildly muscular body built by years of unrelenting hardship, but in this profound moment, she looked entirely breathless. Garrison walked over to the stone hearth. He held the lumber company contract over the dancing flames and let it fall. They watched together as the heavy paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash, destroying the last chain binding her to a life of misery. "You are a free woman," Garrison whispered gently, turning to face her. "No one will ever look at you as a burden again. This is where the memory settles, much like the gentle embers of a dying campfire on a quiet winter night. The harsh winds of the frontier eventually fade, leaving behind only the profound warmth of the souls brave enough to find each other in the dark." Rowena did not simply survive the deadly storm. She blossomed within the absolute safety of the mountain cabin. She realized that her incredible physical strength, the heavy muscles, and the towering frame she once hated were the very tools she needed to build a beautiful life. She used those massive, capable hands to carve out a thriving homestead, turning the lonely cabin into a vibrant sanctuary filled with laughter, deep connection, and overflowing grace. Garrison laid his heavy grief to rest entirely. He learned that his protective heart still held an immense purpose, not in wielding a silver badge or a heavy rifle, but in loving a fiercely compassionate woman who saw the absolute best in him. He traded the deafening silence of his solitary retirement for the joyful noise of a true family, proving that second chances are always possible for those who dare to open their hearts. As the sun rose higher into the clear blue sky that Christmas morning, they sat together by the crackling fire. Garrison placed the delicate, hand-carved wooden horse gently into her palm, no longer a symbol of heartbreaking loss, but a promise of the beautiful future they would build together. They held each other close, two heavily scarred souls finally finding their rightful home in the warm, unbreakable embrace of true love. This story is a work of fiction. Names, characters, businesses, places, events, and incidents are either the products of the author's imagination or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. This story is intended for mature audiences seeking wholesome, family-safe, PG, emotional romance and contains no explicit content, graphic violence, or mature themes outside of general emotional hardship and historical frontier settings.